And I get to keep this box. Is that right? This is my box now. So, if you want to go that way. Bye, Olivia.
Thank you. Come on, let's go.
Always the hardest part of the liturgy at St. Paul's. But it keeps you on your feet, right? You've got to keep it simple, right? They give you an owl. What are you going to do, right? A plush owl, no less. So my name is Brian, and it's my joy to serve as your bishop. And we've been doing this now almost 6 years. Seems like it just started. And I wanted to slow down because I wanted it to last for a while. It is great to be with you all. Thank you for being St. Paul's. Your clergy leadership, your staff, your folk, the folks who've led in confirmation class, reception. Also know that this morning, so the folks right here have made some intentional promises and practices for the day. They're going to be confirmed into the Episcopal Church. They're going to be received into the Episcopal Church. We're going to celebrate them. You all also have a practice here at St. Paul's, which is in the prayer book, that also allows for a time of reaffirmation, okay? So I think what's going to happen in a few moments after the sermon, I'm going to make my way back to the altar, and folks who are going to be confirmed and received will come forward, and there'll be a laying on of hands of folks being confirmed and received. The thing I want to say, particularly the folks who are being received from other Christian bodies into the Episcopal Church, when I place my hands on your head, I'm not going to look for a reset button, okay? The story of God that is in you is what you bring with you into this tradition. And you make us better by bringing that story with you. If you do have a reset button on your head, I probably will tell you just so you can talk to a doctor. But I will not actually in any way push reset, right? And those of you who are being confirmed, also no reset button on your head. Because what God has done in you, God will continue to do in you. And today is a chance, it's a threshold moment, just to say, God is still working in you. And God is still changing you. And God is still growing something in you. And that thing that God is growing in you is good. Okay? If I had a plush owl, I would give it to each one of you right now, right? But it's about God's wisdom now. And to the people who aren't being confirmed and aren't being received, this reaffirmation is a chance. It's like an Episcopal altar call, okay? It's a chance if you want to come forward, and music will be playing, in just sort of a meditative, contemplative sort of prayer walk and say, I want you to know God is working in my life in a way that I want to be intentional about that and want you to pray over me. And that's what I'm going to do, okay? Now, to be clear, God is working in all of our lives, right? Sometimes it's really clear, and sometimes that churn is below the surface and you can't tell. But just know that confirmation will happen, receptions will happen, reaffirmation will happen. I don't plan to ordain anyone unless something really crazy happens, okay? But those three things could happen today. Confirmation, reception, reaffirmation. Whenever I come to St. Paul's, I have to always remind you, you're named after St. Paul. You know that. But it's an important, complicated saint who's connected to your story, right? Like if you did like the little diagrams and the little circles connected, like if you put all that together, almost the most complicated saint would have to be Paul. If you think about Paul was present at the stoning of Stephen, right? Talk about a low point in your religious journey, okay? You're present at the stoning of Stephen. And then there's that powerful, haunting phrase. It's like Paul thought this was a good idea. Paul approved of this. So you're named after someone who was present at a religious killing and thought it was a good idea. Talk about a comeback, right? Talk about God can find anyone God chooses to find. God found Paul on the road to Damascus, which is right up there in that beautiful stained glass. And in finding Paul, God thought, I'm not going to condemn you. I'm going to redeem you. I'm going to bring you back. I'm going to work through you. And we're going to always have that paper trail. We're going to always have that paper trail. Paul, for the rest of your life, if we did a Google search, that story of you and Stephen and approving of that killing, that's always going to be there. It's always going to be there. You can either run away from it, or you can just say, that was me. And God has chosen to work through me. So I would say this morning, if you think, I don't think God can reaffirm me. I don't think God can work through me. If you're at a church named after St. Paul, I got a pretty good idea God can work with you. Because Paul was present at a killing and said, that's a good idea. And God said, I'm not going to condemn you, I'm going to redeem you. And then if you heard the reading from 1 Corinthians this morning, I would encourage you to keep reading Corinthians and then just keep on going and read 2 Corinthians. Talk about a great church fight, okay? I mean, Corinthians is just chock full of conflict and just a wonderful throwdown around the religious tradition of the Christian story. And again, you think, if you've been in a conflict in a church, you got nothing on Corinth, all right? Again, these people are going toe-to-toe with Paul. They're thinking, who's Paul? Why does he matter? He's from away. He doesn't know us. So the beginning of this passage in Corinth, it sounds still kind of light and easy and kind of just getting things started, but a real fight is brewing. A real conflict is brewing. And it's this age-old conflict in the Christian story about grace and about works, okay? It's been with us since the beginning. That if you remember, Jesus calls really imperfect people to be disciples who need a lot of grace. But he also says things to us like you're salt and you're light, which sounds pretty impressive, right? To be salt and light. He's not simply saying you're salt or you're salt. It's more like a southern Jesus, like y'all are light, right? And y'all are salt. He's talking about a whole community. In the Episcopal Church, we love both you as the individual and we love you in a community. So on one hand, yes, you are salt, you are light, you matter to God, and the best way we can often matter is in that imperfect community. The challenge of each other. The person that pushes you or pushes me, that helps me to grow or helps you to grow, sometimes whether we want to grow or not. So Jesus calls imperfect people, and he calls them salt and light. And he's kind of pouring into them the idea that there are great works you'll be able to do, which would suggest it's all about works, right? Go do 47 things for Jesus this week, and come back and we'll punch your card, and we'll give you 47 things next week. If you read the passage from Isaiah, it's about make sure your religious practice and your lived experience are in alignment. If you say these pious prayers, live a life that says, I care for the poor, I care for the oppressed. Make sure these things are in alignment. So it looks like we're saying it's about works, works, works. And in many ways, we do want to say that Jesus being poured into you, that he's calling you salt and light, gives you the power to do those things. But Paul's having to work it out with these people in Corinth. And one of the problems is there's these fancy evangelists out there, right? There are these really charismatic speakers. They're better spoken than Paul. Paul kind of stumbles on stuff. He apparently is sort of underwhelming, right? If you did a survey on Paul, he would needs improvement on a lot of stuff. If you keep reading those passages of those letters to Corinth, there's already kind of a prosperity gospel going on. I found Jesus and my skin cleared up, right? Or I found Jesus and I got a new job. And it's been there from the beginning, right? And there's Paul with all that acne and he lost his job and he's trying to tell you God's working through him as well, but you're thinking, I don't know, Paul. That other guy's skin looks awesome, right? And it's why Paul, in these letters to Corinth, has to keep betting the farm on the one thing he has. He says, I don't have wise words. I don't even have a plush owl. All I have is a really awkward story. It's a really awkward story that says true wisdom is found in Jesus and Jesus crucified, which sounds like a really awkward story to lead with, right? That's what you brought to Corinth? This failure? This religious trauma? That's what you're bringing? Because the other guy's got clear skin and full employment, and you've got Christ crucified. It's why he has to keep talking about the way in which God's grace is not simply in his mind or in his intellect or as a theological category. He says, grace is in my body. And he keeps talking about it in the second letter to folks in Corinth, about that thorn in the flesh, that thing in his body, that place of suffering. And he's thinking, if I really love Jesus, all my deals should work out, right? If I really love Jesus, I wouldn't need all this sea breeze in the morning, right? If I really love Jesus, this thorn should be taken from me. And he finally understands, if Jesus has been pierced and I'm following Jesus, then I'm probably going to be pierced as well. And that piercing is not death. That piercing is kind of an awakening, that you are loved. And God loves us so much that it hurts. Because typically, even as humans, when we love each other, it hurts at some point. Now, as your bishop, I'm going to make a confession. Is that okay? Can I make a confession? Say, yeah, thank you. For much of my life, I have understood the idea of this strength made perfect in weakness, which Paul talks about in this letter to the folks in Corinth. Strength made perfect in weakness as a paradox, right? As a literary device. I'm the son of an English teacher, and I love words. When they say, Jesus was the Word, like, I'm down for that, right? I think that's my jam. Like, I can live in that space, right? If you say strength made perfect in weakness, literary device, I can go there with you. So for much of my life, the idea of strength made perfect in weakness, Paul's defense in these two letters, I think about it being in your mind, something you're defending intellectually. But what's important to remember, and I think we need to know particularly today, is Paul makes that case not in some sort of intellectual debate. He makes it by showing the people his body. There's a thorn in my flesh. I am suffering. And I pray to God, and I keep suffering. So I realize I have been pierced as Jesus has been pierced. And it's in the honesty of the piercing that God shows up. And God's grace shows up. And God says, you're salt and you're light. Not despite the weakness, but through the weakness. So the confession is this. For much of my life, I've understood this as an intellectual idea. Strength made perfect in weakness. But in the last few months, I now understand that grace needs to touch my body as well, right? To be honest, for so much of my life, my body has just worked, right? So in junior high, I did need eyeglasses. That was awkward. I was 12. It helped me understand that last season of Little League Baseball when I was a pitcher and quite ineffective. I now get that now, right? The main thing I threw were gestures of spiritual encouragement to the batters. So I knew I needed glasses. Other than that, my body just worked. Tall enough to reach things, strong enough to tote things. So grace was in my mind, but my body was all about works righteousness. Until this last year, when I began to realize I would go to church receptions. You ever been to a church reception? Right? There's little triangle sandwiches, and been to those? And there's people there, right? And they're talking. Are they talking sometimes? And I couldn't hear them, right? It was just all noise. And it was fine because there's plenty of sandwiches to eat, so I would just eat the sandwiches and try to be nice, and you're just, whatever you're saying, I'm just eating a sandwich, right? But it happened enough that I thought, I should get my hearing checked, right? So I went to my doctor. My doctor's currently 24 years old, and the doctor in training program in Knoxville that we have, and he said, yeah, we'll get you set up with an audiologist. And right, I'm going to do this thing. So I go to the test, and there are two 15-year-olds who are audiology and training program in Knoxville, and they sit me down, and I explained that my trouble hearing, I think, but could they test it? Sure. They're writing stuff down like Papaw can't hear is what they're writing down writing these things down. And so they test my hearing, right? They test my hearing, and then the test is over, and I think, okay, surely I've passed, right? I'm really good at testing. I test well. I don't get nervous at tests. I flunked, okay? I flunked. They said, you have real hearing loss, particularly in this ear, your left ear. So I went back and told my staff that I needed hearing aids and said, my hearing's bad, particularly this ear. And the diocesan staff said, yeah, we knew that. We knew that about you. We knew that was your bad ear. And so my experience has been that I think I understand all the more those of you who in your bodies have found your bodies sometimes not working, that you are a kind of evangelist, a proclaimer of the gospel in ways that so often we do not fully appreciate, right? You think about our friends, or maybe it's you in recovery, and you learn about what your body can or can't do. That's why often people say that's true religion in that church basement, right? Because too often in my life, and I'll admit this to you now as your bishop, it's been just in my head. The grace of God has been in my head, but in my body, I had to work it out on my own. And so now when I put these hearing aids in my ears, and I become a kind of cyborg, right? It's a humbling process. And it's just a slight example of what Paul was doing. Paul is saying, you got some slick preachers in Corinth. They got the best skin you've ever seen. They got that full employment program. All their deals work out. All I've got is a real raggedy story of Jesus, crucified and pierced. And his piercing somehow doesn't keep you from being pierced in life, right? Wouldn't it be great if, because he was pierced, you and I will not be touched, like some force field just protected you always? I would sign up for that deal, right? I want my skin to look that good. So the story we have of Jesus truly is a foolish story, y'all. He was pierced, and you're going to be pierced, and I'm going to be pierced. And that is all we have. That is our story. So we shouldn't try to dress it up more than that, because it is a foolish story. But what's so important today is at some point in our lives, and it might be the very end of your life, you will need grace to touch your body. And you can treat it like that thing you want to put in the back of the medicine cabinet. Just in case, if I can't do it by myself, go into the medicine cabinet in the guest bathroom and get that for me. But I really want to mostly do it all by myself. That's one way to live. Or realize grace is not this thing that is rare. Grace is all around us, wanting to touch you, wanting to say you're salt and you're light even when you don't feel like it. Jesus is saying this to disciples who have just shown up, right? They have just filled out the newcomer card in the Gospel of Matthew, and Jesus is already saying, you're salt and you're light. So I'll say to you this morning, whether you feel like it or not, you're salt and you're light. God is going to descend upon the confirmands. God's going to descend upon the folks being received, the folks being reaffirmed, and even if you're in the back ducking, God's going to descend upon you and desire to touch your body, not just your mind. God loves your mind, but for the gospel to take up residence in your bones, in your very bones, loved of God. Amen.